In this Diablo 4 video, I'm going to be showing you my Stormcaller Druid Build. This is a beginner Druid build meant for like the first 30 or so levels of the game, and is focused around World Tiers 1 and 2, sort of giving you an idea how you can make like a lightning-based Druid build at the beginning of Diablo 4. So the general concept of this build is to use the Lightning Storm skill, which is your core skill for this build, and the way Lightning Storm works is that you hold down the attack button and more lightning will come out. You can obviously tap it, you don't have to hold it. But more and more lightning will come out as you do this until you get up to like a maximum of like 6 or 7 lightning bolts depending on the passive that you took. And if you don't use Lightning Storm after like 4 seconds, it will reset back down to 1. So when you start out trash pulls or boss fights, whatever, you're going to start with 1 lightning bolt coming out, and the longer you use it, more and more lightning bolts are going to come out. So the key is to keep that up as much as possible so that you're hitting as many targets as possible at the same time. So just a little bit more information about Lightning Storm is it kind of comes out as a conal AoE in the direction that you're facing, and the lightning bolts kind of come out randomly in that cone. That means you might hit an enemy more than once with it, and if you can get an enemy backed into a corner where there's very little space, you can actually hit them with all these bolts and absolutely melt them, so that's a very valid strategy. But you'll need to turn your character to aim in the direction of enemies that you're facing. It doesn't just hit in a 360-degree AoE, and you don't have to aim. And also, because you have 4 seconds that the game sort of holds the amount of lightning bolts that you've built up, you can alternate between this and Storm Strike to build up more spirit and then keep casting this. But the idea here is you don't want to let more than 4 seconds go before casting Lightning Storm in order to keep up the maximum number of bolts. Now, that's just one part of this build. The other part of this build is the lucky hit procs that we gain from this build. There are a lot of effects with this build that trigger on lucky hits. Now, if you didn't know, skills in this game have a lucky hit chance. Each skill has a different amount, and you can also boost your lucky hit chance by equipping gear with a lucky hit chance on it, which will make it more likely to do this. Now, lucky hits happen somewhat regularly in this game because the chance of some of the skills is rather high, but the effects that happen when you get a lucky hit usually have a percentage chance. So that means if you see something like 20% chance on lucky hit, that means you have to trigger a lucky hit, which is maybe like 1 in 5 attacks for most skills, and then you have a 1 in 5 chance when you trigger a lucky hit. So the higher your lucky hit chance, the more often you're going to trigger these effects. And we trigger all kinds of effects with this build. We trigger the vulnerable status effect, we deal extra lightning damage and immobilize enemies, we summon additional lightning bolts, we restore spirit. There is a lot of things we do with lucky hit with this build, and I'll get into more of that later. And then once we gain the key passive Perfect Storm, we'll also deal increased damage to vulnerable, immobilized, and slowed enemies, but more importantly, we'll gain 1 spirit back each time we strike an enemy that has one of these status effects, helping us to maintain our Lightning Storm a lot more easily since we will use this on CC targets a lot of the time. I will say there is one major downside to this build while leveling though, and that's that there are not a lot of legendary aspects that are good for this build early on. There are a lot more later, but still there are a couple that you should be on the lookout for, and one of them is Aspect of the Umbral. This gives you spirit whenever you crowd control an enemy, which you constantly do for this build, so that helps keep your spirit up so you can keep channeling Lightning Storm. And the other is Aspect of Inner Calm, which increases your damage the longer you stand in place. When you're holding down Lightning Storm, which you do a lot with this build, you just stand in place when you're casting this, and this increases your damage over time while you're doing this. The downside of the second one there, the Aspect of Inner Calm though, is that you need to progress a ways in the Act 2 story in order before you can get it. However, you can go directly into this story. You don't have to finish Act 1 in order to do it, so you can get it pretty quick. So those things being said, let's take a look at the skills we use for this build. We have Storm Strike as our basic attack. It does lightning damage, hits in a kind of cone in front of us, and the way we have it set up here with the Fierce Storm Strike upgrade is it has a 50% chance to apply Vulnerable, which is really good for this build. Not only increases your damage to enemies, but also we get extra damage from Perfect Storm. So this works really well, and it also helps to refund Spirit when you attack these enemies that have Vulnerable. So there's a lot of good synergies with this here. The downside to this is that it is a melee skill, which means you need to get close to enemies, even though this is predominantly a ranged build. However, I find that it's not too much of a problem, and the lightning damage has a lot more synergy than something like Wind Shear would, which would be the ranged option that does physical damage. For instance, the Bad Omen passive will trigger additional lightning bolts when you lucky hit vulnerable enemies, and you'll do that a lot with this skill. So you're going to trigger additional lightning bolts, which actually makes your basic attack deal relatively decent damage. And of course, the Perfect Storm key passive I already mentioned, that'll help you gain spirit back as well. Next up, we have Poison Creeper in this build. We really don't use this for the damage here, we use it for the CC, because we have increased damage against crowd control and immobilized enemies from the things I mentioned already. You can also use a staff, which increases your damage against crowd control enemies natively, and you can look for that bonus on your weapon, so you can deal more damage to crowd controlled enemies. So this is really, really good, and I like to take the Brutal Poison Creeper upgrade for this because it gives you plus 20% critical chance against people that are, or enemies that are immobilized by this ability. And that's a lot. We have like, you know, depending on where you are in the game, you have about a 15% crit chance. So that's going to bump that up to about 35 against these enemies, which isn't bad for this part of the game. Next up is Hurricane. We don't really use Hurricane for its damage here. The damage of Hurricane is abysmal at this part of the game. There's not really a lot you can do to increase it, even with a legendary aspect that increases Hurricane damage over time. It really doesn't ever get better at this point. So maybe there's some build endgame that does, but here we're really taking it for utility because it slows enemies inside it, and it also reduces the damage they do to you, which helps keep you alive. And since you're kind of in the middle of enemies a lot, this really helps, and it'll increase your damage against, you know, slowed enemies, which is good. Next up is Lightning Storm, which is the bread and butter of our build, and as I mentioned, you want to hold this down in order to get maximum out of it, or just tap it, you know, repeatedly. And you want to make sure you use it every 4 seconds to keep those maximum bolts out in order to hit enemies. And obviously you want to alternate between this and something like Storm Strike, or make sure that, you know, Hurricane is up, or, you know, Cyclone Armor, you just used it before you cast this if possible. And this is ideally used after you've maxed your Spirit. So I like to go into combat and build up Spirit with Storm Strike. If I don't have it built up, wait till I have like a full Spirit gauge and then start going to town with it. Otherwise you'll have to stop yourself before you can build up a lot of lightning bolts, which can be kind of annoying. I will say the passive that you upgrade this with, you know, the 8% immobilization chance or the extra bolt doesn't seem to matter too much, so just pick whichever you like. And then finally we have Cyclone Armor. You have plus 10% non-physical damage passively when you have this equipped on your bar. This will be the little gray swirls around you. If you see that, that's what's going on. That's going to increase your, you know, non-physical damage reduction all the time. But when you pop the active version of this skill, it's going to knock enemies back, it's going to slow them, and once you have this passively upgraded, it will also apply vulnerable to enemies that you knock backward. So then when you attack them with your lightning bolt, they're going to take increased damage from vulnerable, they're going to take increased damage if you have damage against CC'd and slowed, and they absolutely melt when you do this. And when you're surrounded by enemies, this can save your life. I mean, a lot of big enemies get right on top of you and they have a long windup that's going to hit you. If you pop this, you'll knock them backward, interrupt them, it'll save you, and then you can just absolutely melt them with Lightning Storm. And then we come to our ultimate ability, which is Cataclysm for this build. This is a really, really strong skill. It does like lightning bolts randomly around the screen and tornadoes. Lightning bolts apply vulnerable to enemies when this is upgraded, which helps to increase your damage for a lot of reasons. And then tornadoes slow enemies, which helps to increase your damage as well. And you can wipe out an entire screen of enemies with this ability up in like a couple of seconds. It's really, really strong. And one really great synergy here is if you take the Spirit Boon, Calm Before the Storm, you have a 15% chance when you lucky hit to shave 2 seconds off the cooldown of this skill when you use a nature magic ability, which like all of our abilities are. So that's absolutely fantastic, and this thing has a really long cooldown, so shaving seconds off of that is really good. So some final tips here before we wrap up this video. The first thing is Lucky Hit. Make sure you have this on every piece of gear that you can possibly get Lucky Hit on, and make sure you upgrade the gear that has Lucky Hit, because this will increase the chance of Lucky Hit on it. It'll increase it by a little bit each time you upgrade it, so make sure you get your Lucky Hit up as high as possible. Now, all the things that take advantage of Lucky Hit in this build, the first is Energize. This is a Spirit Boon that gives you a 15% chance to restore 10 Spirit when you deal damage. This is absolutely huge because you need Spirit for this build in order to channel Lightning Strike or Lightning Storm. So it's really important to have that, and that's a good one to take here. You also have Overload, which gives you a 20% chance when dealing lightning damage to emit a static discharge around the target, dealing more lightning damage to enemies around it. So that's another thing that can proc from Lucky Hit. Keep in mind that all these Lucky Hit chances roll independently, so even if you don't trigger one, you might trigger another one. So just having a bunch of Lucky Hit is really good. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Calm Before the Storm. This gives you a chance to shave off 2 seconds off your cooldown when using Nature Magic when you Lucky Hit. This is really, really good too. And then eventually you'll get Elemental Exposure, which allows your Storm skills to have a 10% chance on Lucky Hit to make enemies vulnerable, and as you upgrade this, the length of that vulnerability enhances, so this is also good. And then when you get Electric Shock and you have that fully upgraded, you're going to have a 15% chance to immobilize enemies when you deal lightning damage, and this is great because immobilized enemies are going to take more damage from you because of all the passives that we have, and if they're already immobilized when this triggers, then they're just going to take increased lightning damage, which is great. And then Bad Omen, which we mentioned earlier, has a 30% chance when fully upgraded when you deal damage to vulnerable, immobilized, or stunned enemies to cast another lightning bolt. So this means you're going to get extra damage. And this is really helpful with your single target damage too, which is probably the sore point of this build because it has tons of AoE, is that when you're attacking an enemy, you might get extra damage from this, so that'll help melt them really quickly when that triggers. And also keep in mind on your gear that you can get Lucky Hit to execute enemies that are injured, that aren't elites, like a percentage chance to do this when hit with damage. This is really, really strong for this build too, because you're building for Lucky Hit. So this will allow you to wipe out groups of enemies even faster if you can get it on something. So besides bonuses to the skills we use for this build, you're also going to want to look out for damage against vulnerable. This is really, really good for this build because you have so many different ways of applying vulnerable. You want to increase your vulnerable damage as much as possible. And the second is damage to crowd-controlled enemies. Anything standing in your Hurricane is going to be crowd-controlled. Anything hit by your Poison Creeper will be crowd-controlled. And anything hit when you use Cyclone Armor is going to be crowd-controlled. So you have a lot of ways of doing this. If you go for slowed, this will only apply to Hurricane and Cyclone Armor, but not immobilized. So I would suggest going for crowd control if possible, but slowed is also pretty good because 2 of those 3 skills also slow. And lastly, this build doesn't have a lot in the way of healing early on, so I strongly recommend relying on your potions, getting something like life on kill on your gear or your weapon. If possible, you can slot skulls in there to increase your life on kill, which can help keep you alive. Getting life regeneration while not damaged recently is also good to top you off outside of combat. And then also getting the Circle of Life passive, which heals you for 3% of your max HP when you use a nature skill. When you're spamming Lightning Storm, you'll be healing yourself. So this is also a good one to pick up eventually. So that wraps up our Stormcaller build. I hope you guys found that helpful. It's just a beginner Druid build kind of aimed at, leveling through World Tiers 1 and 2, kind of head you in the different direction. There are obviously more legendaries and things that apply to this build that you can't get reliably that we will cover in the level 50 version of this build. But these are things you can do while leveling this build that, make sense and everyone can get.